Friends and family of 44-year-old Alino Faso share tearful embraces as a casket bearing his body returns home. He had been held in Ivory Coast since January, accused of spying.
It started with one death and ended the illusion of peace. When Alino Faso, a Burkinabè patriot, died mysteriously in Ivorian custody, Ibrahim Traoré didn't send condolences. He sent 3,000 soldiers. What looked like a tragedy is now a test of sovereignty, pride, and Africa's red line. How many times can you kill an African voice before the continent finally answers back? Let's find that out. It began not with speeches or negotiations, but with the grinding roar of armored trucks rolling south through the Burkinabè countryside. Men in fatigues, faces hard with discipline, eyes sharpened by duty, 3,000 of them, ordered to mobilize toward the border with the Ivory Coast. To some, it appeared to be preparation for war, but to those inside Burkina Faso, it felt like something far deeper, justice finally taking its own course. The command came directly from Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a man whose rise to power redefined what leadership means in a post-colonial Africa. To his supporters, Traoré isn't just a president. He's the physical manifestation of rebellion against every foreign finger that's ever tried to press Africa's neck down. And now, that finger, according to Ouagadougou, has an Ivorian glove. For months, tensions had simmered quietly. Accusations, whispers, unconfirmed reports of cross-border espionage and sabotage. But the catalyst wasn't military, it was human. Alino Faso, a Burkinabè influencer and fierce defender of the revolution, had been arrested in the Ivory Coast in January 2025 on allegations of espionage and conspiracy. For 6 months, he disappeared from public life. Then, in late July, his body reappeared, lifeless, scarred, and silenced. Ivorian officials called it suicide. Burkinabè officials called it murder. And for the millions who had followed his passionate videos, where he spoke about African unity, self-reliance, and Traoré's defiance of the West, there was no doubt. Alino didn't take his own life. Someone took it for him. The news spread like a wound reopening. Within hours, the streets of Ouagadougou turned into a sea of red and green flags, the colors of revolution and resistance. People chanted his name, not as a victim, but as a martyr. Protesters gathered outside the Ivorian embassy demanding answers while posters read, "You silenced a voice, not the people." That was the day Burkina Faso stopped treating this as diplomacy and started treating it as betrayal. To Traoré, this was more than the death of a citizen. It was an attack on Burkinabè sovereignty. The government statement was not a complaint, it was an indictment. The circumstances of Alino Faso's death are incompatible with human dignity and international law. In his next speech, Traoré's words were colder, slower, and heavier. They can kill the body of a Burkinabè, but they will never kill the soul of our independence. Those words weren't rhetoric, they were marching orders. And so, the deployment began. By early October 2025, satellite images showed Burkinabè convoys establishing fortified positions near Banfora, Sindou, and Niangoloko, strategic gateways into the Ivory Coast's north. Officially, these were defensive maneuvers, but everyone knew the symbolism. The Sahel's youngest military leader was sending a message not only to Abidjan, but to every capital watching from a safe distance. Burkina Faso will not be humiliated twice. In the international media, the move was painted as reckless, provocative, even dangerous. But within Africa, a different story was being told. For the first time in decades, a government had responded to the death of one of its citizens with action, not silence. For many Africans, it wasn't aggression, it was awakening. The Ivorian government, under President Alassane Ouattara, issued statements denying any wrongdoing. They called for restraint and respect for the rule of law. Yet those words rang hollow to a region that has long watched Western-aligned governments hide behind law when justice fails the people. In Ouagadougou's eyes, the Ivory Coast was no longer just a neighbor. It had become a symbol of the system Traoré vowed to dismantle. The system that shields foreign interests and silences African defiance. But beneath the tanks, protests and declarations lies a quieter truth. The death of Alino Faso wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was the final drop in a bucket that had been filling for years, one shaped by coup plots, ideological rivalries, and the struggle for control of Africa's narrative. The storm had broken, but to understand why Traoré moved from diplomacy to deployment, we must look beyond the battlefield and into the story of the man whose death shook an entire nation, and why he mattered more alive than any politician could admit. And that story begins with a single question. Who was Alino Faso, and why did his voice threaten so many powers at once? When the armored trucks rolled south, they weren't just carrying weapons. They were carrying a story, his story. Because Alino Faso wasn't merely an influencer, he was a mirror of a generation that had found its voice in the digital age and refused to whisper anymore. The government may have seen him as an activist, but for the Burkinabè youth, he was a prophet of pride. Born in Bobo Dioulasso, Alino rose from the dust of poverty to the glare of a smartphone camera, where he transformed everyday frustration into fiery conviction. He spoke about the hunger for justice, about Africa's endless dependency on outsiders, and about Traoré's promise to end the begging bowl politics. His videos, raw, emotional, unpolished, carried something no Western-trained analyst could mimic: authenticity. He spoke in the language of the people, sometimes poetic, sometimes profane, but always precise. So when news came that Alino had been arrested in the Ivory Coast, accused of espionage and conspiracy, it didn't sound like law enforcement. It sounded like silencing. For 6 months, nothing was heard of him. His followers demanded updates. International rights groups asked for proof of life. Silence. Then came July 2025. The Ivorian authorities released a statement. Alino Faso died in his cell. Cause of death? Suicide. No images, no autopsy details, no witnesses. Just another story to file away in the endless archives of unexplained deaths. But this time, the narrative didn't stick. Because Alino wasn't a quiet man, and his silence screamed louder than ever. In Burkina Faso, the announcement triggered something visceral. Crowds didn't mourn in private. They took to the streets. His death for them wasn't personal. It was symbolic of the old African tragedy, the erasure of inconvenient voices. A young man who had built hope through words was gone, and the place of his death, a neighboring African country, made it even more painful. It wasn't the West this time. It was us. The Ivorian government's response only added insult to injury. Their version of events, that he hanged himself using a bedsheet, was received in Ouagadougou as a diplomatic slap in the face. People asked the obvious question: how does a high-profile political detainee manage to kill himself under 24-hour watch? And more importantly, why did it take days before the news was even announced? Within days, the Burkinabè government launched a judicial inquiry, demanding access to all case files and autopsy results. But Abidjan stonewalled the request. That refusal turned suspicion into fury. It was no longer about human rights. It was about national dignity. Alino's funeral became an earthquake. The entire country seemed to stop breathing as his coffin, draped in the national flag, was brought home from Abidjan. The crowd that followed stretched for kilometers. Young men on motorbikes, mothers carrying children, soldiers standing at attention. No state funeral could have matched the emotion that poured through that day. People shouted, "He died for truth! He died for Africa!" For many, Alino's body was no longer that of a victim. It was a banner. It symbolized every African who dared to speak the truth and paid the ultimate price. It also symbolized something more dangerous for Abidjan: the possibility that his death could unite a fragmented nation behind one man, Ibrahim Traoré. Traoré's silence in those first few days was strategic. He didn't need to speak. The street spoke for him. Every chant, every tear, every poster that read "We are Alino" strengthened his legitimacy. The people weren't demanding vengeance. They were demanding respect. And that's where the story deepens. Because behind the outrage and the tears, one question began to take shape. Whispered first in markets, then shouted in rallies. Was Alino's death just a tragic event, or was it part of a much larger plan? The timing was too precise, the place too convenient, the explanation too thin. To many Burkinabè, his death wasn't random. It was orchestrated. And if that's true, then it wasn't just a crime against one man. It was an attack on the revolution itself. That suspicion, That invisible thread connecting Alino's death to something larger is what transformed this tragedy into a national emergency. Because once the Burkinabè people started asking why, their government began asking who. And that's when the tanks started moving. But what if this wasn't only about justice or pride? What if Alino's death was just the surface wound of a deeper infection, one spreading across borders, built on years of mistrust, espionage, and quiet sabotage? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. By the time the last crowd in Ouagadougou had buried its anger, the first convoys were already on the move. The death of Alino Faso had ignited the streets, but what came next ignited the state itself. The Burkinabè government didn't issue another statement, it issued orders. Within hours of closed-door meetings at the presidential compound, troop mobilization began. Thousands of soldiers were pulled from internal counterinsurgency units, reorganized, and redeployed southward. The objective wasn't to attack, not yet, but to draw a line of sovereignty that no one would dare cross again. This was not reactionary chaos, it was strategic choreography. Each unit had a purpose, each convoy a message. While the world saw trucks and rifles, Ouagadougou saw symbolism, a people standing tall where diplomacy had failed. Traoré knew that the move would trigger international panic, but panic was part of the plan. For years, Burkina Faso had been treated like a fragile state, a chessboard for foreign peacekeepers and regional lectures. But this time, the young leader was crafting something new, a doctrine of active defense. He wanted to prove that African sovereignty no longer meant waiting for permission to protect one's own. Behind the deployment lay months of intelligence assessments that never made the headlines. Burkinabè military files, according to insiders, had traced several networks of armed groups, propaganda cells, and exiled political operatives to Ivorian territory. Some were remnants of the pre-coup elite, others were mercenaries with funding from Western-linked NGOs. Together, they formed a quiet but corrosive front, one aimed at destabilizing Traoré's government from across the border. So when Alino Faso died under suspicious circumstances, the puzzle snapped into place. To Ouagadougou's security chiefs, his death wasn't just a tragedy. It was proof of infiltration, and once proof arrives, hesitation dies. Thus, the military buildup began in what officials called Operation Southern Shield. The 3,000 deployed troops were stationed along critical zones, Banfora, Sindao, and Niangoloko, controlling the southern trade corridor that links Burkina Faso to the Ivorian heartland. The mission was simple, to show strength where weakness was expected. But on the ground, the soldiers knew this was more than a show. They weren't guarding borders, they were guarding memory. Many of them had listened to Alino's broadcasts before heading into the field. He had told them that African soldiers were not pawns, but protectors of history. Now in his death, his words became their orders. The military's internal briefing described the move as a preventive countermeasure against foreign-based subversion, but the tone was unmistakable. This was not about prevention. This was Burkina Faso's awakening. Across the border, in Abidjan, the reaction was diplomatic discomfort mixed with nervous denial. The Ivorian government called the deployment unjustified and provocative. Yet, it avoided escalation, insisting on dialogue through established channels. Still, it was clear that Abidjan had been caught off guard. No one had expected a small, landlocked country, long considered vulnerable, to challenge a major coastal power so openly. But Traoré understood something others didn't. Perception is power, and in the Sahel, perception builds legitimacy faster than bullets win wars. His message to the region was precise. Burkina Faso would not be bullied, lectured, or manipulated. International observers, particularly in Paris and Washington, were quick to condemn the mobilization. They warned of regional instability and urged de-escalation. But their statements only confirmed what Traoré's supporters already believed, that Western voices only call for peace when African nations start asserting themselves. Inside Burkina Faso, however, morale surged. The same youth who had cried at Alino's funeral were now volunteering for local defense brigades. Posters appeared in towns reading, "The South is not for sale. The North has woken." Burkina will stand. By the time international journalists arrived at the southern frontier, the transformation was undeniable. What had once been an army fighting insurgents had become an army defending an identity. Alino's death had turned into a doctrine. His silence had turned into a strategy. But as soldiers dug trenches and flags waved over command posts, a new question began to emerge, whispered among diplomats and analysts alike. Was this about justice, or was Traoré rewriting the map of power in West Africa? Because if Burkina Faso was ready to confront the Ivory Coast over one man's death, then it wasn't just sending troops, it was sending a signal to every government still living under the shadow of foreign approval. And that leads to the question that now haunts every capital from Dakar to Abuja. How did two nations once bound by shared history, language, and struggle become the front lines of Africa's ideological divide? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. What began as a standoff of soldiers is now unraveling a history buried beneath decades of politeness. To understand why Burkina Faso and the Ivory Coast stand on opposite sides of a continental fault line, you have to return to the forgotten wars of words and ideals that shaped both nations. Because this crisis, this new Cold War of the Sahel, didn't begin in 2025. It began generations ago, when two visions for Africa were born side by side, destined to collide. When Thomas Sankara ruled Burkina Faso in the 1980s, he represented the fire of independence. He rejected foreign debt, expelled imperial advisors, and told his people that he who feeds you controls you. Across the border, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, the Ivory Coast's first president, was the opposite, the diplomat who believed survival meant staying close to Paris. The two men met, but never understood each other. Sankara wanted a new Africa. Houphouët wanted a stable one. And when Sankara was assassinated in 1987, the line between those two Africas hardened into ideology. That line never disappeared. It only evolved. Traoré's revolution resurrected Sankara's ghost, and the Ivory Coast, under Ouattara, inherited Houphouët's loyalty. 2 generations later, the same invisible border, revolution versus restraint, sovereignty versus submission, has resurfaced, only this time with armies on both sides. It is this history that explains why Alino Faso's death struck such a raw nerve. For Traoré, the incident wasn't merely a crime, it was an echo of betrayal, a reminder that every African who dares to speak against the established order ends up silenced by those still protecting it. In Ouagadougou, Alino's killing was not the act of an isolated government. It was a symptom of an Africa still chained to foreign patrons, acting on behalf of interests that do not belong to Africans themselves. Abidjan, of course, sees it differently. In their version, Burkina Faso's accusations are paranoia dressed in patriotism. They point to the Alliance of Sahel States AES, the coalition of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, as a bloc of rogue juntas that have defied ECOWAS and risked plunging West Africa into isolation. In contrast, the Ivory Coast presents itself as a model of economic growth and democratic continuity, a bridge between Africa and the West. But that self-image comes with a cost, because for much of the Sahel, Abidjan no longer represents African stability. It represents Western protectionism in African clothing. French troops may have withdrawn from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, but their influence lives on in Abidjan's security architecture, intelligence networks, and training programs. The alliance between Ouattara's administration and Western partners is not secret. It's celebrated. To Traoré's supporters, that makes the Ivory Coast not a neighbor, but a proxy outpost of old power. The animosity isn't just ideological, it's personal. After Traoré's 2022 coup, several ousted Burkinabè officials fled to the Ivory Coast, where they were reportedly granted refuge. Since then, Ouagadougou's intelligence services have accused these exiles of orchestrating propaganda campaigns and coup attempts from Ivorian soil. In April 2024, a failed plot against Traoré's government was traced, according to Burkina Faso's military, to communications originating in Abidjan. The Ivorian government dismissed it as fiction, but for Burkina Faso, it confirmed what it had long believed. that its sovereignty was being undermined from across the border. This is why the deployment of troops in 2025 cannot be understood as an overreaction. It is the culmination of years of quiet hostility cloaked in diplomacy. Every meeting, every handshake between Burkinabè and Ivorian officials over the past 2 years now reads differently, less as peace talks, more as veiled confrontations. And caught between them is a region that can no longer pretend neutrality. Mali and Niger have already sided openly with Traoré, framing the confrontation as a defense of Pan-African dignity. In Bamako, state media praised Burkina Faso's decisive stance against manipulation. Meanwhile, Abidjan's allies in ECOWAS have called for restraint, thinly disguised as concern but widely interpreted as pressure. This division is no longer just political, it is civilizational. One Africa is trying to reclaim itself, to stand independent even if it bleeds for it. The other still seeks validation from its old masters, believing obedience guarantees peace. But history has shown that peace built on dependency is simply war postponed. As border patrols dig trenches and radio signals jam between the two armies, the unspoken truth is clear. This isn't about Alino Faso anymore, it's about the survival of two different Africas. And the real fear echoing through West Africa tonight isn't whether Burkina Faso will cross the border. It's whether the rest of the continent will have to choose which Africa it belongs to. But that choice, between submission and sovereignty, between fear and freedom, is one that Africa has faced before. The difference now is that this generation seems ready to answer it. And that leads to the final question, one that hovers like thunder over the Sahel. If this is the new Africa rising, how will the continent face the storm it has summoned? The storm has broken, not in gunfire but in meaning. The tension between Burkina Faso and the Ivory Coast has become more than a border dispute. It is the loudest signal yet that Africa is rewriting its rules of power. For decades, nations were told that peace meant obedience, that order meant silence. But Ibrahim Traoré's response to the death of Alino Faso has flipped that script entirely. What the world sees as confrontation, Africa is beginning to see as correction. The ripple effect is undeniable. From Bamako to Niamey, from Conakry to Dar es Salaam, young Africans are watching a nation that refuses to kneel. Social media is flooded with messages calling Traoré the defender of Africa's dignity. For once, the streets are not echoing Western press conferences or NGO talking points. They're echoing a belief that Africa can stand up for itself, even when the price is confrontation. This is where the story turns from national defense to continental awakening. Burkina Faso's defiance is being read as a blueprint, an example of how smaller nations can assert sovereignty without waiting for approval from Western capitals or regional blocs like ECOWAS. The alliance of Sahel states AE, now comprising Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, has begun transforming from a defensive alliance into an ideological movement, one that prioritizes African unity over international diplomacy. And in this ideological realignment, the old order is crumbling. Ivory Coast, once seen as the West's golden gateway into Francophone Africa, now finds itself surrounded by nations that no longer answer to Paris. The political language of stability and foreign partnership that once sounded virtuous now sounds submissive. Even nations outside the Sahel, Senegal, Guinea, and Chad are quietly recalibrating, studying how Traoré's unapologetic nationalism has restored confidence in a population that once doubted its own agency. But what makes this moment more powerful than any coup or protest is that it was sparked not by warlords or generals, but by the death of a civilian voice. Alino Faso's story has become the moral backbone of a larger transformation, a reminder that revolutions don't always begin with bullets. Sometimes they begin with injustice too large to ignore. His death created a moral vacuum that Traoré filled not with vengeance but with assertion. It's as though the soul of a fallen patriot became the compass of a rising continent. Still, this awakening carries danger, because revolutions that rise from moral clarity often attract opportunists, and West Africa is no stranger to manipulation. If Burkina Faso's defiance is misinterpreted as aggression, it could justify intervention under the pretext of restoring regional peace. Western governments and international institutions are already framing Traoré's moves as destabilizing, a word that has historically preceded sanctions, embargoes, or worse, engineered coups. Yet, for all the external pressure, the internal momentum is unstoppable. Burkina Faso's youth are no longer spectators in their nation's story. They are building farms instead of waiting for aid. They are volunteering for defense programs instead of watching foreign troops guard their borders. They are reclaiming not just territory, but identity. The doctrine that began with sovereignty is now evolving into a philosophy, self-sufficiency as resistance. And this is the part that terrifies the old powers most. Because once a generation learns to live without dependency, control loses its leverage. The more Burkina Faso fortifies itself, politically, economically, and psychologically, the harder it becomes for foreign influence to creep back in. Ivory Coast, in this light, is not just a neighboring state in dispute. It is the last frontier of the old system trying to hold ground in a region that has already chosen liberation. If Traoré holds this line, if his soldiers return home without invasion, but with deterrence intact, it will mark a turning point for the entire continent. It will show that African strength need not come from Western weaponry or UN mediation, but from moral conviction and unity of purpose. The irony of it all is that the man whose death sparked this transformation, Alino Faso, may have achieved in death what he only dreamed of in life, an Africa that refuses to bow. And now, the burden of that dream sits on Traoré's shoulders. Because the next step is no longer about sending troops or issuing warnings, it's about building the Africa that Alino died believing in. An Africa where justice isn't begged for in foreign courts. An Africa where borders don't divide brothers, but defend their dignity. An Africa where one nation's pain becomes the continent's purpose. So as the world waits for the next headline, Africa is writing its own, quietly, defiantly, and together. Because this time, the revolution isn't televised, it's lived. Do you think Africa's new generation is finally ready to defend its dignity without waiting for permission from the world? Let us know in the comments section. Should African nations risk confrontation to protect their sovereignty, or does survival still depend on compromise? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.